the kind of world we have built, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, has produced a situation of what I would call mass alienation. Most people don't have satisfying jobs anymore. Most of the jobs are routine, and there's a sort of a sense of meaninglessness about a lot of the work that people do. There have been some surveys in the United States recently, and it turns out that 70% of the population either hates going to work or is completely indifferent to the work that they're doing, which means that only about 30% of the population gets any satisfaction from the kind of work they're doing. There are similar kinds of things happening in the realm of consumption. Consumerism has been pushed, particularly for elite groups. So we have, on the one hand, conspicuous consumption, hugely conspicuous consumption, which is the sort of thing you come across in central cities. You know, you watch the tourists, you watch everything that's going on, people running around with bags of goods and things, and it looks like this is a kind of a cornucopia of desire, and people are fulfilling themselves. But you go a little way away from the center of the city and you find the mass of the population in, say, New York, living in conditions of poverty. So there's unmet needs on the one hand and conspicuous consumption on the other hand, which I think is producing what I would call a kind of almost mass alienation in relationship to what consumerism is about and what consumption is about. So you start to see the emergence of popular cultural movements which are about what I would consider a search for meaning, alternative meaning to that which exists simply by in the monetary calculus. And along with that, there are, I think, very conscious movements, and this is why something like this theatre, Teatro, Valle, is a good example, where it seems to me the movement is a conscious understanding that that is what is being searched for. And that in searching for it, nobody is absolutely clear what these new values might look like and what these alternative values look like. All we do know with certainty is the values are not those which are given by the monetary calculus. They're not those given by conspicuous consumption. They're not those given by neediness of the mass of the population. It is an alternative way of creating meaning in people's lives through engaging in cultural practices which often involve new ways of social relating, new ways of understanding our relation to nature, a different sensitivity to urban environments, what they should look like, what they should feel like, how daily life should be lived. So there's, if you like, an experimentation going on with daily life in the city. And that experimentation is something which I think is backed with this idea of the right to the city, that we have a right to build cities in a different image than simply that which is given by what the developers want and what the big financial institutions want, that we want a city which is not like that. We want something that is different. And I think for me, one of the interesting things is that when you ask yourself the kind of question, what kind of city do we want to live in? That cannot be divorced from the issue of what kind of people do we want to be and how do we want to be. And therefore it's the remaking of ourselves and the remaking of the world around us which goes hand in hand. And I think cultural projects are absolutely central to that exploration. And I think that therefore this is a very exciting moment where if cultural projects can be supported and validated, I think that it is one of the ways in which we can start to explore the possibility of developing a rather different kind of world and different forms of value to those given in the monetary calculus. We've had over the last 30, 40 years a particular emphasis in economic development on the so-called, quote, cultural industries. And I think this is a real problem. because the cultural industries try to commodify, if you like, many of these things that I've been talking about. So there's always this danger. And of course, some of the cultural producers, in a way, are very happy to be sort of co-opted. I mean, because they get a better living and all this. So there's a complicated kind of relationship between the commercialization of cultural activities and the utilization of those cultural forms to gain what I call monopoly rents because of the uniqueness of and authenticity of what exists in say some aspect of urban life. So there's the commodification of culture is part of the problem, but then the commodification can be turned the other way. To the degree that cultural producers are, I think, keenly aware of the dangers of commodification, but at the same time can use the commodification to gain resources to explore even further. So there's a dialectical relation, if you like, between how capital tries to co-opt and commodify cultural activities and how the cultural producers might be able to actually turn that around and use it in a different kind of way. My own view is that there's been far too much museumification, if you want to call it that. I mean, when I first went to the city of Baltimore back in 1969, I think there were 3 museums. There's something like 30-odd museums now. Every place is opening museums of everything. And I have to say, you know, some of this is not, doesn't seem to me to be, you know, very helpful. But some of it is appropriable by the cultural community in ways which are you know, possibly very progressive. So I see it as a dialectical kind of relation. And yes, there are traps, and yes, there are dangers which attach to cultural industries being part of an economic development strategy, which is associated with you know, building museums, gentrification, Disneyfication of a lot of the central cities and turning them into pretty-looking places and to the tourist eyes, so that they don't, you know, they then lose a lot of their character of being proper kinds of public spaces. I mean, from the standpoint of the real development of urban life, are spaces where different things can happen, which are open to the politics of encounters, which are not regulated in the ways that sometimes state apparatuses come in. So I get very nervous when cities start emphasizing the development of cultural industries as being central to what their economic development strategy is. I think, well, that's maybe the end of, you know, kind of really vibrant kind of street culture, and that, you know, there's a danger of that. One of the things, a very general comment I'd have about this is that we tend to think of the spaces of the city as being divided between public and private. And we tend to have the view that public spaces are open to the public. But actually, a lot of public spaces in the city are tightly regulated, tightly controlled, and they're not open to the public at all. And it therefore means that if I want access to some space for something or other, it's very difficult to find one. And what I think was so interesting about many of these movements which occurred in cities, you know, like in Syntagma Square or Plaza del Sol in Madrid, was that they turned a public space into a commoning. And of course that happened in Tahrir Square too, and turned in Taksim Square, that a public space was turned into a commoning. But you can see immediately how the authorities didn't like that. They don't want the public space to be open to the public. They don't want it to be part of the commons. So I like to think of different property regimes. There's a state property regime, which is about public space. There's a private spaces, which are a certain sort. But in between, we need to build a common property sensibility and a commons. and to encourage democratic practices in the city, and to encourage people coming together and discussing and deciding on what shall or shall not happen, and how it shall happen in a particular area or in the city as a whole. So having assemblies seems to me to be one of the democratic ways, but in order to have assemblies you need to have spaces open where you can easily assemble, and that we should have a public right to that. That should be a right. It shouldn't be something where we have to go to the administration and sometimes be denied, like for instance, when we wanted to have a protest in New York and we wanted to go into Central Park, we were told we couldn't use Central Park because we might hurt the grass. And you kind of go, the political rights of grass trump the political rights of people. Yeah. And so when you look at the way in which many public spaces have been re-engineered and exclusionary practices, yeah, we desperately need a kind of a tradition of commoning to grow, and an insistence that the state should not be in a position to stop us exercising sort of democratic rights within urban environments. Yeah, there's going to have to be a popular movement against state regulation of the public spaces that say you cannot do this or you cannot do that. I mean, I would like it if it was mandated, say, in a city that the public schools are always open for use by the public for assembly purposes, and no questions being asked if it's a left political meeting or a right political meeting or what it is. You know, I mean, you want the right to have access to those spaces, and we don't have. And it's very curious. You look at a city and you see all these spaces, but yet they're not open for political purposes. And of course, one of the other reasons they're not open for political purposes is because of, quote, the fear of terrorism and you know, and all the security and the militarization of urban spaces, which we're now witnessing, and all of these closed-circuit television surveillance things going on in the city. I mean, we live in a very society that's full of surveillance, and it's also highly regulated, and I think we need democratically to break some of that down in order to liberate ourselves from this kind of world in which, well, it's private or it's public, and I can't do anything in either of those spaces. We need the third space.